JJK's ending is, well, let's just say contentious. Some people swear that it's the worst ending in the history of manga, while others think that it's good enough for the story that JJK was. However, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of how you feel about JJK's ending, one thing is unfortunately unanimous amongst everybody who's at least completed the manga, and that is the understanding that a lot of the things that got set up over the duration of the 271 chapters of JJK didn't really get appropriate endings. Now, as to how much those individual plot lines that didn't get appropriate endings actually mean to you, well, that's up to you. Those that are furious that every single plot thread didn't find its home at the end of this manga think the ending of JJK is rushed and awful. However, those who feel as though not every single introduced storyline needs some kind of crazy ending for the end of the manga to be good believe that the ending of JJK is, well, good enough. And thus today, I want to take both of these opinions into consideration. See, I'm of the opinion that JJK's manga ending wasn't perfect. Far from it, in fact. However, with the addition of the final volume extras, JJK's manga ending did get a little bit better, as many of the most important lingering questions that us JJK fans were left with did get answered. However, that doesn't mean that every lingering question left in JJK did get answered. And thus today, I want to go through every single plot line that Gege Akutami left wide open, either in actuality or in the eyes of the fans. Because here's the thing, there's a lot of discourse over JJK's manga ending, and a lot of that discourse is actually rather misinformed. While there is legitimate gripes to the ending of JJK's manga and legitimate plot lines that never get fleshed out or explained in a meaningful capacity, a fair amount of the plot holes that people reference when talking about the ending of JJK's manga actually have answers. And thus today, I scoured the internet to try and find every single plot line that people believe wasn't resolved in JJK's manga, and I'm going to do my best to either explain how these plot lines were never resolved, or use evidence from the manga to show everybody that these plot lines were actually resolved, just maybe in less significant ways than you might have wanted. And thus, with no further ado, let's get directly into every plot line that JJK abandoned explained. But before we get to explaining any kind of abandonment, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video a week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We are in the middle of the Forest of Death, and Rock Lee is squaring up with some sound ninja. Now, there's really no concrete and perfect way for us to tackle all of the unresolved plot lines from JJK in a logical order. I'm just kind of gonna start. One of the most talked about and one of the least explained plot lines that gets set up during JJK's manga that we never get a real answer to is basically everything revolving around America's involvement in the Culling Game. See, while many of you probably remember that for some reason America showed up during the Culling Game and abducted a couple of sorcerers, what you probably don't remember is the fact that Kenjaku literally travels to America, goes into the White House, kills a bunch of people, does a live demonstration for the president and all of the important cabinet members of the president about how terrifying the power of cursed techniques and cursed energy can be. He then basically tells the most important members of the American government that if you want to get your hands on cursed users or cursed spirits and capitalize on what is quickly being identified as the strongest source of power in the entire world militaristically, that you're gonna have to come to Tokyo, because these kinds of things only pop up in Tokyo. Now, this was obviously done intentionally on account of the fact that the Culling Games were being hosted in Tokyo. I mean, they were being hosted in a myriad of places, but Tokyo is one of the more prevalent places that a lot of the Culling Games colonies were. And thus America takes the bait, and they send a bunch of soldiers to Tokyo to kidnap sorcerers. And while a couple of these soldiers have a really bad time, they are successful in their endeavor of kidnapping sorcerers. And then well, they just leave. And while in chapter 270, Maki does tell us that sorcerers from Japan need to go to America to get the sorcerers that were kidnapped back, that's basically all we get. America deploys troops inside of Japan in an act of aggression, kidnaps Japanese citizens, and then nothing really happens from it. And like, well, yeah, we understand that there was some vague concept of a plan to get these sorcerers back. We A, don't know what America is doing with these sorcerers, and B, don't know what Japan is gonna do about these Japanese citizens being abducted. And this plotline not having any answers kind of makes you wonder why it was introduced in the first place. I mean, yes, obviously the introduction of American soldiers shooting up Tokyo has the possibility to increase the amount of cursed energy being output in a Culling Game colony, until you consider the fact that everybody inside of a Culling Game colony is a cursed technique user and therefore barely leak any cursed energy in the first place. So as to why the plot line of America being involved in the Culling Games was introduced, well, We legitimately can't say. Some speculate that the American government showing up was supposed to be a forced ending to the Culling Games. Like, oh, now that the American government has swept in with a bunch of soldiers and kidnapped a bunch of sorcerers, who all, mind you, would need to die before the Culling Games came to an end, would lead to the natural conclusion of the Culling Games. But once again, there's really no reason to speculate. It's a completely useless plotline that's introduced for basically no reason. But now that we've started with a plotline that basically has no resolution whatsoever, I kind of want to continue on that note and work our way slowly but surely to all of the plot lines that a lot of people talk about that do actually have resolutions that a lot of people don't know about. Which brings us to a secondary plot line that a lot of people talk about that also doesn't have much of a resolution, which is the nature of Kenjaku and Tengen's past. See, we know next to nothing about the Heian era. And this is actually one of the major complaints of a lot of JJK fans, because a lot of really important things happened in the Heian era, and we know next to nothing about it. Like, yes, we get occasional flashbacks into Yorozu, Sukuna, and Arame's past. We see Yorozu in love with Sukuna, we see Arame and Sukuna living together, and that's about it. But Kenjaku, Sukuna, and Tengen all lived and existed presumably pretty close to each other in the Heian era. And Kenjaku and Tengen seemingly know each other. However, as to how they know each other is never explained. This obviously rides off a bigger issue that Tengen is just underutilized in JJK. We understand that Tengen is responsible for maintaining a myriad of barriers around Japan. And these barriers do everything from hiding Jujutsu academies, suppress cursed spirits, strengthen barrier techniques, and so much more. And thus it would make sense that Kenjaku wants to bring chaos to Japan and let cursed spirits run free, or at least would want to use their powers for his own means. However, that doesn't necessarily explain how Tengen knows things like Kenjaku being the second greatest barrier technique user in Japan only after Tengen. Is that just something you learn when both of you have been alive for 1,000 years? And why didn't Tengen tell anybody about Kenjaku? See, Tengen could have hypothetically been a massive asset for the good guys in JJK, but instead was kind of just sidelined until they were an important chess piece to take for Kenjaku and Sukuna. On top of this, after the defeat of Sukuna, Tengen's remains are inside of Sukuna's remains, and those remains are simply placed in the Star Room. And apparently just those remains are enough to maintain all of the barriers around Japan, at least for a little while. That brings us to another unresolved plot line. What's gonna happen to all of the barriers across Japan? Like I just stated, these barriers are instrumental in a myriad of different things. Whether it's suppressing cursed spirits or increasing the power of barrier techniques, these barriers are instrumental in making sure that Japan is not overrun with cursed spirits, and ensuring that Jujutsu sorcerers stand a good chance at survival in their ongoing battles with these cursed spirits. However, at some point in the future, these barriers are going to disappear. And the only resolution we get in regards to the idea of this is Gakuganji, the current head of the Jujutsu Society, appointed by Gojo after he killed all of the elders of the Jujutsu Society, telling Utsuhime to not worry about it because she's young and they have time to figure it out. And while it does coincide with a lot of the themes of the ending of JJK, which is that the elderly waste that's kept the Jujutsu world divided for decades, if not centuries, is now gone and is now being led into a brighter future by the younger generation, it's still not a concrete answer. It's just kind of a vibe. Like, yes, a lot of the ending of JJK, that being chapter 271 and the extras given to us at the end of the final volume, spend their time making sure that we know a lot of the main characters from JJK's story have gone on to leadership roles. And thus, as these main characters have all gone on to leadership roles of either important clans, the new Shadow Style School, or even just the entirety of the Jujutsu Society, because they're friends, the Jujutsu world is probably as connected as it's ever been, and a whole lot less politic-y, something that Gojo, the strongest sorcerer of the time, wanted and essentially set up. And as we do see Maki and Yuta's grandchildren messing around rather peacefully, it's safe to say that either the barriers haven't collapsed, or that if the barriers collapsed, they figured out a way to remake them, or the barriers collapsing didn't really do anything all that catastrophically important to Japan. The key takeaway is that the world still exists, and that probably has something to do with the main characters of JJK being good leaders. But since we're talking about main characters like Yuta, Maki, Megami, and maybe even Yuji taking over in important leadership roles, but let's get to another talking point that is brought up all the time in regards to JJK not even finishing its own story, which is what happened to the Jujutsu Society? What happened to the noble clans? Weren't they all in shambles by the end of the story? And the answer is yeah. See, JJK established to us that there was 3 noble clans. Now, these 3 noble clans weren't necessarily the biggest clans, but they were the most important. They were the most powerful. They held the most political sway. And those three clans were the Kamo, the Zenin, and the Gojo. Now, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, these three clans have existed on top of the Jujutsu society. However, by the end of JJK's manga, all three of these clans are essentially eradicated. See, the Kamo clan, which is famous for Noritoshi Kamo and Noritoshi Kamo, and therefore by extension all of the Death Womb paintings like Chozo and kind of Yuji, are masters of blood manipulation. Powerful curse technique that when wielded correctly made some of the most powerful sorcerers in the entirety of the Jujutsu world. However, when Kenjaku finally starts to move out in the open, one of the first things that he does is wipe out a vast majority of the Kamo clan and kill Noritoshi Kamo, the new Noritoshi Kamo's father, who was the 24th head of the Kamo clan, and instill himself as the 25th leader of the Kamo clan. Now this kind of makes sense because at one point in time Kenjaku was the OG Noritoshi Kamo, the guy who made all of the Death Womb paintings. And while that Noritoshi Kamo was thrown out of the Kamo clan, you know, for like forcing pregnant women to undergo abortions, Kenjaku always had an inherent connection to the Kamo clan. Now this means for the majority of the ending of JJK, the Kamo clan, one of the most powerful noble clans in all of JJK, was being controlled by Kenjaku. However, as we all know, Yuta decapitates Kenjaku and kills him. And thus now, not only is Kenjaku destroyed the majority of the Kamo clan and instilled himself as the 25th head, but when his head hit the floor, there was no head to the Kamo clan. Well, then some of you might be thinking, oh, well then the new Noritoshi Kamo probably took over as the head of the Kamo clan. I mean, he was the son of the old 24th head, right? So it would only make logical sense that the new Noritoshi Kamo, who was perplexingly named after a literal monster, would take over as the 26th head of the Kamo clan. And while that is a possibility, the new Noritoshi Kamo, maybe as a response to being named after a literal monster, is trying to be the best guy that he possibly can. And that means not stepping on anyone's toes. And so much so that he literally bows out of the battle against Sukuna with the Kushikabe coalition because he's kind of sick of putting his life on the line all the time. And that I understand. And that's a sentiment that probably could have been passed along to Chozo. And therefore the idea that the new Noritoshi Kamo would actually take over the Kamo clan to replace Kenjaku seems rather slim. He wasn't treated well by the Kamo clan. Well, that is to say his mother wasn't treated well by the Kamo clan. And while maybe becoming the 26th head of the Kamo clan would allow for him to change it from the inside, I just don't think he would do that. And considering that the majority of the Kamo clan was wiped out when Kenjaku invaded it and killed Noritoshi Kamo's father, there's not a whole lot to lead over. So if the new Noritoshi Kamo is not going to do it, then who would? Well, maybe Yuji. See, while Yuji isn't technically a Kamo, he's also technically a Kamo. Yuji's mother is kind of Kenjaku, and Kenjaku is kind of Noritoshi Kamo, which is why Yuji's able to use piercing blood and why Chozo considers him a brother. And as Yuji, post Sukuna's death, is one of the strongest sorcerers left alive, it actually wouldn't be all that crazy of an idea if Yuji were to take over the Kamo clan. However, unfortunately, this is just a theory. There's no concrete evidence that tells us what happens with the Kamo clan. However, we can infer that either Noritoshi Kamo or Yuji picked up as the next head. And I'd like to think that it would be Yuji and he would do it for Chozo and the rest of his deceased brothers. But still, there's no answer with what's going on with the Kamo clan, but there is an answer with what's going on with the Gojo clan. See, a lot of people are under the misconception that Gojo was the only member of the Gojo clan. That's not the case. However, Gojo was the only important member of the Gojo clan. Gojo, as the head of the Gojo clan, and by far and away the strongest member of the Gojo clan, is the only member of the Gojo clan that we ever really get introduced to. However, the Gojo clan does exist outside of Satoru. And therefore, when Gojo died, while the Gojo clan lost basically all of its power, it's not like the Gojo clan disappeared, which is why Yuta and Maki taking their positions at the top of the Gojo clan made so much sense. Because while Yuta is not as strong as Gojo, even though he tried to be, I mean, he literally tried to beat Gojo for a little bit there, Yuta and Gojo were technically related, as both the Okotsu and the Goju were descendants of the Sugawara clan, who were actually involved in the battle against Sukuna in the Heian era 1,000 years ago. And therefore, because Yuta and Gojo shared a common ancestor of Michizane Sugawara, Yuta was able to take over as the head of the Gojo clan. And therefore, the Gojo clan is actually probably in the best position out of any of the three noble clans. Certainly a lot better than the Zenin. See, because here's another misconception. A lot of people believe that the Zenin is entirely gone. And for the large part, it is. But it's not completely eradicated. See, there's this piece of misinformation going around that at some point the narrator says the Zenin clan is now extinct, after Maki's done with her rampage through the Zenin clan, killing all of the fighting men and women. However, there is undoubtedly plenty of children and non-combatants in the Zenin Zenin clan, who Maki did not kill. If she did kill them, she'd be worse than any other member of the Zenin clan ever. And thus, well, yes, all of the fighting forces of the Zenin clan were eradicated. There was still undoubtedly some crumbs of the Zenin clan left. And those crumbs are technically for Megami to lead. See, because Megami was selected as the next head of the Zenin clan pretty much immediately before Maki decided to eradicate the entire clan. And thus, while some people come to the conclusion that Megami isn't the head of the Zenin clan because the Zenin clan no longer exists, the Zenin clan, well, at least still does kind of exist because Maki Zenin still exists. If it was just Maki and Megami, well, technically that'd be a really small clan. I do believe there are other Zenin that Megami is most likely leading over. Which brings up a rather interesting point that a lot of Gojo students ended up as the heads of noble clans that Gojo hated. And while this doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on with the noble clans, if they've been dissolved, if they're still important in the world of Jujutsu, it does show us that Gojo's will has kind of been enacted on the entire Jujutsu society. Whether it be killing the elders and placing Gakuganji as the sole leader, or dying himself and supplanting himself with Yuta as the head of the Gojo clan, it seems as though Gojo was successful in breaking down the Jujutsu society he hated so much and replacing it with people that he believed would be able to lead it into a better era. And while, like I said, these aren't hard, concrete answers, it is technically something to sink your teeth into. On top of this, the three noble families and the elders of the Jujutsu society weren't the only institutions that were broken down by the end of JJK's manga, as also the new Shadow Style School had its leader killed by Meimei and a new leader in the form of Kusakabe elected. Now, rather perplexingly, when it came to grand institutions in the Jujutsu world, we got the most explanation about what was going on with the new Shadow Style School than we did for anything else. As in chapter 269, almost half of the chapter is dedicated to Meimei explaining how the new Shadow Style School takes advantage of sorcerers who aren't able to use inherent curse techniques and forces them into binding vows that not only require them to come to all summons, but also supposedly siphon off their life force to the head of the new Shadow Style School. But now that the new Shadow Style School is undoubtedly the strongest institution in all of the Jujutsu world, with the three noble families all falling into dust, we don't necessarily know what Kusakabe is going to do with the new Shadow Style School. I mean, we knew that the previous head wanted to grow the power of the new Shadow Style School until they were able to absorb the entirety of the Jujutsu society for themselves, but as to whether or not Kusakabe has any of those same ambitions, well, one, I doubt, but two, we don't know. But as you can see, we had a fair amount of answers to all of those gripes, which means that we're heading into the territory of supposedly unresolved plot lines that do actually have resolutions. And a prime example of that is how people complain about how little we know about Yuji's parents. See, yes, we understand that Genie Chidori was the reincarnation of the twin that Sukuna ate in the womb, and therefore his child would hypothetically be the perfect vessel for Sukuna, and therefore that's why Kenjaku was so singularly focused on him. But some people want to know what happened to Yuji's mom before Kenjaku took over her body, and how Yuji's grandfather knew Takashi Jin against being with Kenjaku. And it's in this point in the video that we get to the who cares section. See, a multitude of things could have happened to Yuji's mother. Either Kenjaku could have killed her, she could have died of natural causes, there could have been a cursed spirit on her, but all this to say that she was kind of doomed in the fact that she married Genie Chidori because Kenjaku needed Genie Chidori's back shots to make Yuji, the perfect vessel for Sukuna. And as to how Yuji's grandfather was able to identify that Kenjaku was bad news, well, oh, I don't know, maybe the stitches across the forehead? Or just the generally evil nature of Kenjaku? Well, sure, yes, Yuji's grandfather probably wasn't a curse technique user. It doesn't take a genius, just somebody who's non-biased to realize that that's no longer Jin's wife, and something nefarious instead. Piggybacking off that who cares attitude, a lot of people have gripes with how Megami's story comes to an end. See, because while Megami does play a major role in the ending of JJK, it's not necessarily up to him, because pretty much from the moment that Sukuna pops into Megami's body, well, Megami's gone, and not until Sukuna's defeated does Megami come back into the story, at which point he really doesn't do all that much. And while in this very video we've already speculated that Megami took on the role of the head of the Zenin clan after the defeat of Sukuna, one that's not confirmed, and even Meimei herself says now that the Zenin clan has been destroyed in chapter 269, and two, we basically get no information about what happens with Megami after chapter 271, as he was the only one out of the three last students of Gojo, that being Yuji, Nobara, and Megami, to not get an additional scene. So what happens with Megami? Can he use Sukuna's curse technique like cleave and dismantle like Yuji because Sukuna was inside of him so long and their cursed energies intermingled? Was he ever able to complete his domain expansion? Was he able to live up to the crazy potential that everybody said that he had? Well, we don't know, but once again, who cares? It's not really relevant to how Megumi's story plays out. Well, yes, I would have loved to know what was going on from him from a human level. As to how his powers scale out after the story is done, I could care less. However, I don't necessarily feel exactly that way for a rather similar character to Megumi, and that's Yuji. See, while yes, you can absolutely make the argument that understanding A, how Yuji's domain expansion works, and B, its name doesn't matter now that the story is over, and that the only reason you would need to understand what Yuji's domain expansion does is so you could power scale him properly or something like that. Yuji is, regardless of how hard Gege Akutami tried, the main character of JJK. And understanding how his domain expansion works, because mind you, a domain expansion is an expansion of your innate domain, which is basically just your soul, would allow us better insight into who Yuji is as a character, and so would understanding the name of the domain expansion. See, I'm not trying to understand what Yuji's domain expansion does so I can use that information to argue with people on the internet, but I think not explaining what Yuji's domain expansion does is actually a big miss from Gege Akutami in allowing us, the reader, to better understand the main character of this universe. But enough about the endings for the good guys, let's talk about the endings for the bad guys. Specifically Kenjaku / Geto, because basically everything that pertains to that duo is unresolved. And probably the most important thing, at least as it pertains to Kenjaku or Geto, is the fact that the Culling Games never end, and probably can't. See, the rules of the Culling Game state that either all of the sorcerers in the Culling Game need to die, or all of the sorcerers but Megumi and Kenjaku need to die to initiate the merger. However, as neither of those things came to pass, the Culling Games technically cannot end. Now, that's a pretty insane plotline to leave unresolved, which is why Gege didn't leave it unresolved. See, it's explained in chapter 268 up to 270 that while the Culling Games themselves cannot technically end, the Kusakabe Coalition and the rest of the Jujutsu Society has found a way to free those involved. See, any of the sorcerers in the Culling Games who are either awakened or brought back from some other time period, if they are violent and want to continue the Culling Games, are killed. However, peaceful sorcerers, those who simply want to be done with the Culling Games now that they know all of this madness, can either have the cursed object that was placed inside of them by Kenjaku destroyed by Angel's cursed technique, Jacob's Ladder, or Yuji is able to use his cursed technique that is also able to break somebody away from the cursed object that was used to turn them into a sorcerer. And thus, by destroying all of his cursed objects that either turned people into sorcerers or brought sorcerers into their bodies, these people who are no longer sorcerers are simply able to walk out of the barriers of the Culling Game. But since all of the barriers of the Culling Game still exist, Tokyo is pretty much all but abandoned, with the entire world now knowing about cursed spirits, but believing that cursed spirits only come from Tokyo itself. And therefore, Tokyo is shut down, at least for the current moment. But yeah, if the resolution for the idea that the Culling Games haven't ended is, well, yeah, the Culling Games haven't ended isn't satisfactory to you, that is 100% understandable. It's a bad explanation. And unfortunately, kind of like with Tengen's Barrier, the manga takes the approach of, meh, we'll figure it out. And we as readers who won't see when they do, meh, figure it out is, well, kind of aggravating. But there is technically an answer to this unresolved plotline, just like not a good one. But since we're talking about aggravating plot lines that never saw a logical conclusion, but did get some form of conclusion, we should talk about Yuki / Geto's dreams. See, one of the most prevalent talking points throughout JJK is the idea of somehow, some way, the eradication of cursed energy. See, cursed energy is kind of an anomaly that really only exists in Japan. It exists elsewhere, just not as bad. And that's because apparently there's a lot of misery in Japan, and there is. But because of this, all of these miserable people are constantly leaking out cursed energy. And that cursed energy forms into cursed spirits that cursed users have to defeat. Now, however, there is two forms of humans who don't leak out cursed energy, and those are Jujutsu sorcerers and those who have undergone heavenly restriction. And thus, if all of Japan were either Jujutsu sorcerers or those who have undergone some form of heavenly restriction, the cursed energy that would leak from them as a population would basically make sure that cursed spirits were a thing of the past. However, that sounds a lot easier than it actually is, because not everybody has the affinity to becoming a Jujutsu sorcerer, and achieving heavenly restriction is only something that 2 people in the entire story have ever accomplished. And thus, while Yuki was set on trying to find a way that the entirety of the Japanese population would be able to be inflicted with some kind of heavenly restriction, as after all they weren't using the cursed energy they were leaking in the first place, Geto believed that the best way to get rid of cursed spirits was to kill all non-sorcerers. But which of these ideologies prevailed? Ooh, yeah, neither. And in the end, the cycle of cursed users having to battle against cursed spirits just recontinued. And while that's all well and good, some of the most interesting conversation pieces throughout JJK revolve around this discussion, as we see characters like Geto devolve into madness as they realize all of their friends are gonna have to fight and die for the rest of their lives for all of these people who don't even know they exist. And yet, that system persists. Now, that is technically an ending to Yuki and Geto's dreams, just not a satisfying one, especially when you consider that in the long run, by the end of JJK, Tokyo just simply needs to be abandoned, implying that in a way the sorcerers are actually losing. But speaking of losing, the last important gripe that JJK fans have with the ending of JJK's manga is that throughout the duration of this entire 271 chapter story, we never really get a good look into the Heian era. People are curious about why Arame chose to follow Sukuna, how the battle between Sukuna and the Sun, Moon, and Star clans panned out, and why Sukuna decided to split himself into 20 fingers to be brought back to life 1,000 years later by Kenjaku. As to why Arame follows Sukuna, so much so that he reincarnates 1,000 years later to be with him, because Sukuna stumbled upon them after Arame killed their parents. And Sukuna, who essentially needed a refrigerator, brought Arame to his side and essentially adopted them as a child of sorts. Thus Arame, who was afraid of killing everybody that they got close to, because everybody who got close to them froze to death, finally was met with somebody who wasn't affected by their cold. They pledged allegiance to them. And thus Arame and Sukuna were bound at the hip forever. As to how the battle during the Heian era played out, well, Sukuna didn't lose. He wiped out the Sun, Star, and Moon clans, defeated the Abe's clan's top forces, which included Angel, and the Sugawara Deshi Purification Squad. And after emerging victorious in battle during the golden age of Jujutsu, Sukuna decided that he wanted to fight more powerful opponents, but those powerful opponents weren't around right now. And so Sukuna went to Kenjaku and turned his body into cursed objects. But some of you are asking, why more than one cursed object, Nick? Well, good question. Sukuna's too powerful for just one cursed object, which is why he needed 20. Now, obviously, that adds a crazy layer of complexity to bringing him back to life, but that's just Sukuna. That's how powerful he was. Thus, Kenjaku and Sukuna entered into a contract of sorts that essentially stated that Sukuna would help Kenjaku with the merger if Kenjaku brought Sukuna back during an interesting time filled with very powerful sorcerers he could kill and or butcher. And thus, while we don't know a ton about the Heian era, we certainly know enough. But since we're talking about Arame, what happened in Arame and Akari's battle? I don't know, okay? No one knows. It should have been shown to us. It wasn't. I also want to see Akari hitting a bunch of jackpots, and I want to see Arame getting upset about it. But nope. Arame just disappears when Sukuna does. Yeah, whatever. Oh, I'm getting myself fired up again. But yeah, with that, that's pretty much all of the unresolved plot lines in JJK and all of their at least half explanations. Hope that was good enough for you and didn't just bring back unresolved boiling anger into your stomach like it did for me. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Is there anything that JJK set up that you believe is blasphemous that it didn't get paid off? Let me know in the comments below. And while you go down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh my god, I forgot Takaba brought Geto back to life. I cannot, but that was like the last chapter, and they're like, oh, what a funny gag. What a funny gag it would be to bring Geto and just Geto back to life so it can be in an eternal comedy duo pair with Takaba. Now, is it Geto? Is it Kenjaku? We don't know. Gege doesn't show us the face. I need to stop this video right now.